We all know medical progress has saved countless lives, but what if I told you that a huge chunk of that progress was built on something pretty dark? We're talking desecrated graves and a seriously gruesome illegal trade. So, what happens when science desperately needs the dead, but the law won't give them up? That's the huge problem surgeons and anatomists were facing back in the 19th century. Their search for knowledge, for progress, ended up creating this dark and desperate market that totally blurred the line between science and sin.
All right, let's set the scene. We're in early 1800s London. It's this buzzing hub of medical innovation. Surgeons are making these incredible discoveries about the human body. But to teach, to practice, to get any better, they needed one thing, and they needed a lot of it: fresh human corpses to dissect. The problem? There was a massive, massive shortage. And here's the absolute heart of the crisis. See, by law, the only bodies that could be legally dissected were those of executed murderers. It was actually seen as part of their punishment, an extra indignity. But you had all these new medical schools popping up, and the demand for cadavers just skyrocketed. It created this enormous gap between what the law allowed and what science was screaming for. And just look at the numbers here. It's staggering. Anatomy schools in London alone needed more than 500 bodies every single year. You know how many the gallows provided? Fewer than 55. That is a huge shortfall. It created a vacuum. And you know how markets work. Where there's that much demand, a supply chain is going to pop up no matter how grim it has to be. So, who filled that vacuum? Well, this demand gave birth to a brand new, very shadowy profession. They had a few names, but the most famous one was the Resurrection Men. And no, they weren't actually bringing people back from the dead. Of course not. They were stealing them.
Now, this is a really important point. These guys weren't your typical grave robbers. They didn't give a rip about jewelry or watches or any of that. Stealing that stuff was a felony, a serious crime. They were after the body itself. And here's the crazy part. They were exploiting this bizarre legal loophole. See, under common law back then, a corpse had no legal value. So stealing the body was just a misdemeanor, a much lesser offense. That little detail is what made this whole gruesome business possible. And man, these guys got good at it. They developed these incredibly efficient, almost surgical techniques. One of the most popular was this tunneling method. Instead of digging up the whole grave, which is noisy and obvious, they dig a shaft about 15-20 feet away. Then they'd tunnel underground to the head of the coffin, break open just that one end, and use a hook to pull the body right out. The best part for them, the grave looked pretty much undisturbed. It let them work super fast and super stealthy. And we know about this because we actually have a first-hand account. I mean, how wild is that? A real body snatcher named Joseph Naples kept a diary. It's this incredible piece of history, and it shows just how relentless this work was. This quote here, I mean, it doesn't sound like some ghoulish hobby, does it? It sounds like a grueling, physically demanding, full-time job. All of it driven by that insatiable demand from the city's doctors. So you can probably guess how the public felt about this. They were absolutely horrified. I mean, imagine the terror, the rage at the idea that your loved one's final resting place could just be violated like that. And this fear was way worse for the poor, because their graves, often in common burial grounds, were just the easiest targets. So what happened next was basically an arms race between grieving families and the body snatchers. People started going to these incredible lengths to protect their dead. You'd have families literally standing guard over the grave for weeks. They invented heavy, riveted iron coffins. They even built these iron cages called mort safes right over the grave. The goal was to just wait it out until the body was, well, no longer fresh enough to be of any use to an anatomist. And you have to understand, this terror wasn't just about disrespect. It was much, much deeper than that. It was tied to this very profound religious belief. People literally believed that on Judgment Day, you needed your body to be whole for the resurrection. So having your body dissected wasn't just a violation of your grave, it was a threat to your immortal soul. Okay, so the whole business is already pretty horrific, right? Well, it was about to take its darkest possible turn, because some of these resurrectionists started to think there's a much quicker way to meet demand than all this digging. Why wait for people to die and go through all the trouble of burying them, when you could just create the supply yourself? And that right there brings us to the absolutely infamous case of Burke and Hare. These two men, over just 10 months in Edinburgh, murdered at least 16 people. They targeted lodgers, prostitutes, the most vulnerable people they could find, and sold the bodies directly to a well-known anatomy lecturer. When this all came out, the public outcry was just deafening. This was the turning point. This was what finally forced Parliament to do something. The whole case was so shocking, so completely depraved, that it actually gave us a new word in the English language: to be burked. It literally means to be murdered by their specific method, suffocating victims in a way that left no marks, making the body look pristine and perfect for the anatomist's table. Just think about that. A chilling linguistic legacy, for sure. So, the absolute horror of the Burke and Hare murders finally pushed the government to change the law. And while that effectively ended the era of the classic resurrection man in Britain, the illicit trade in human bodies was far from over. It didn't stop, it just evolved and moved to other parts of the world. Yeah, this timeline really shows how it changed. So in 1832, you get Britain's Anatomy Act, which finally created a legal supply of unclaimed bodies for dissection. That pretty much ended the trade there. But the practice didn't vanish, it just shifted. Fast forward and you see an underground bone trade pop up in India. And even more recently, in modern China, bodies are being stolen for things like ritual ghost marriages or for the truly terrifying black market for human organs. And this chart really puts that shift in stark contrast. The basic act is the same, right? Stealing human remains for money. But look at how the motivations have changed. We've gone from supplying anatomy schools to fueling black market organ transplants, serving weird private collectors, and even supplying ancient rituals that have now found a new and very criminal supply chain. And all of this, really, brings us back to a pretty fundamental and uncomfortable question. Back then, the resurrection men were horrifying, but some people actually argued they were a necessary evil for medical progress. Today, the trade is driven by different things: pure profit, desperation, strange traditions. But it forces us to ask ourselves, doesn't it? What uncomfortable compromises are we making right now in the name of our own modern demands? Something to think about.